Good evening, everyone. I'm Kaitlan Collins, and tonight we're diving headfirst into a brewing economic storm that's got car buyers on edge and policymakers scrambling. Picture this. You're at the dealership, ready to drive off in that shiny new SUV, but the sticker price just jumped overnight because of a trade war that's no longer just talk. It's hitting wallets hard. New reporting reveals the ripple effects of President Trump's sweeping tariffs are finally breaking through, with Canadian automakers forced to hike prices as those duties bite deeper. And in Washington? Sources tell me the alarm bells are ringing louder than ever, as the very policy meant to supercharge American jobs risks derailing growth in the heartland. As Canada heads deeper into 2026, the North American auto industry is confronting the unavoidable reality of sustained cost pressures from the U.S.-imposed 25% tariffs on imported vehicles, steel, aluminum, and critical parts. What began as a bold policy push to reshore manufacturing under the Trump administration has now evolved into a grinding economic standoff, with the initial shock-absorbing tactics deployed throughout 2025 finally reaching their limits. Industry insiders and economists point to a clear turning point. In the early months following the tariffs rollout in spring 2025, manufacturers leaned heavily on pre-tariff inventory stockpiles built up in anticipation of the duties. Factories rushed production, dealers front-loaded orders, and companies absorbed incremental costs through internal pricing adjustments, temporary rebates, and supply chain tweaks to shield consumers from immediate sticker shocks. Those buffers, estimated to have cushioned much of the blow in 2025, have largely depleted as the calendar flips into the new year. Charles Bernard, lead economist at the Canadian Automobile Dealers Association, captured the shift succinctly. Manufacturers found and tried to establish ways to shelter the consumer side from tariffs last year, but as we're moving to 2026, those cost pressures are still there and are increasing. If companies can no longer absorb or mitigate the duties through production shifts or inventory draws, the logical next step is passing portions of the burden downstream. Forecasts now converge on an average new vehicle price increase of 3.5 to 4% across the Canadian market for 2026, a notable escalation from the more modest rises observed in 2025. This projection aligns with multiple expert assessments. Some analysts anticipate the climb could hover around 4%, driven by persistent manufacturing cost inflation tied to elevated steel and aluminum duties, doubled to 50% in certain cases, and reciprocal Canadian measures on U.S. origin components. Others foresee a slightly tempered rise, but emphasize that any softening in consumer demand or high dealer inventories will not fully offset the structural upward pressure. The integrated nature of North American supply chains means even vehicles assembled in Canada often incorporate significant U.S.-sourced parts, exposing them to layered costs that ripple through the entire ecosystem. Statistics Canada data from late 2025 reflected only restrained increases in average transaction prices, as manufacturers prioritized volume preservation amid softening sales trends in the final quarter. But the outlook for the full 2026 model year tells a different story. With pre-tariff stockpiles exhausted and no major exemptions or pauses on the horizon, automakers face shrinking margins on every unit produced or imported. Popular models like crossovers, pickups, and SUVs, many reliant on cross-border components, stand to see the most pronounced adjustments. The tariffs' design aim to incentivize domestic U.S. production, but the reality has proven far more complex. Cross-border flows remain deeply intertwined, with parts crossing the border multiple times before final assembly. This complexity amplifies costs rather than containing them, as compliance with USMCA rules for partial exemptions adds administrative burdens without fully neutralizing the impact. Canadian retaliatory duties on select U.S. vehicles and materials further entrench the cycle, ensuring that higher input prices persist on both sides. For everyday buyers, the implications are direct. An average new vehicle transaction price that hovered near $50,000 to $55,000 in recent years could see an additional $1,250 to $2,200 tacked on under the 3.54% range, depending on the model and trim. This comes at a time when affordability concerns already weigh heavily, with high interest rates and broader economic uncertainty prompting some consumers to delay purchases or shift toward used vehicles. Used car markets, meanwhile, show resilience with elevated demand. But even there, tighter new vehicle supply could sustain upward pressure on pre-owned prices. Automakers are navigating this landscape with a mix of strategies. Some are exploring production reallocations to prioritize tariff-compliant lines, while others signal gradual price adjustments spread across segments to minimize competitive disadvantages. Yet the consensus is clear: the era of widespread cost absorption is ending. As one senior industry figure noted, the coping mechanisms that bought time in 2025 are running out, forcing a more transparent transfer of tariff-related expenses to the showroom floor. This price trajectory arrives just as the USMCA review approaches later in 2026, setting the stage for potentially intense negotiations. Both Ottawa and Washington recognize the stakes. The deeply linked auto sector supports hundreds of thousands of jobs across borders, but resolving the impasse will require concessions that have so far proven elusive. In the interim, Canadian consumers brace for the most tangible consequence of the prolonged trade friction: higher costs at the dealership as the full weight of the tariffs finally settles on new vehicle pricing. Washington sources admit growing alarm: prolonged tariffs disrupting U.S. parts supply chains, threatening manufacturing jobs in key swing states despite White House claims of long-term wins. Experts warn the coping mechanisms are gone. Canadian dealers and manufacturers can no longer absorb costs, signaling sustained vehicle inflation heading into the USMCA review year. Retaliatory Canadian duties on U.S. origin autos and parts remain locked in, keeping cross-border flows under pressure and accelerating the shift of higher sticker prices north of the border. Fresh data from Statistics Canada reveals that new passenger vehicle prices in Canada rose only modestly through 2025, with the average purchase price climbing about 4% year over year in some periods, while other tracking sources like AutoTrader reported actual transaction prices dipping slightly by late in the year, down to around 63,000 current to 64s in September, more than $1,000 below the same point in 2024. This restrained movement came despite the early rollout of U.S. 25% tariffs on imported vehicles, plus the doubling of steel and aluminum duties to 50% in certain categories, and Canada's own retaliatory 25% levies on U.S. origin steel, aluminum, and select auto imports starting in September. Automakers and dealers managed to blunt much of the initial blow last year. They drew down pre-tariff stockpiles, rushed into place ahead of the duties, leaned on high inventories to maintain competitive pricing, and implemented internal adjustments, including temporary incentives and production tweaks, to keep sticker shocks minimal for consumers. Industry observers noted that many buyers even pulled purchases forward in early 2025, fearing bigger hikes, which helped sustain volume while holding average prices relatively steady or even lower in some segments. But the buffers that worked in 2025 are showing clear signs of exhaustion as the calendar turns to 2026. Analysts tracking the sector now project sharper upward pressure on new vehicle prices throughout the coming year. Multiple experts, including economists from the Canadian Automobile Dealers Association and automotive data firms, anticipate average increases in the range of 3.5 to 4% or potentially higher, as manufacturers face ongoing elevated input costs from tariffs that can no longer be fully absorbed or mitigated through old strategies. One forecast highlights that companies may no longer be able to rely on the same cost-sheltering tactics, making sustained vehicle inflation more likely if trade frictions persist without resolution. The divergence between 2025's modest reality and 2026's forecasted escalation stems from the integrated North American supply chain's cumulative strain. Parts often cross borders multiple times before final assembly, amplifying tariff layers on steel, aluminum, and components. With pre-tariff inventories largely depleted and no broad exemptions materializing, more of those structural costs are expected to flow through to dealership lots. Popular segments like SUVs, pickups, and crossovers, heavily reliant on cross-border sourcing, could see the most noticeable adjustments. Some analysts warn of even steeper consumer impacts if high-stakes negotiations drag on or falter. Uncertainty around the upcoming USMCA review later in 2026 adds to the tension, as stalled talks could entrench higher duties and disrupt planning for model year production. While a few voices suggest prices might stabilize or see only gradual rises if demand softens further and automakers spread adjustments across segments, the prevailing view points to inevitable escalation, turning 2026 into the year when the prolonged tariff standoff delivers its clearest hit to Canadian buyers' wallets. Behind closed doors in Washington, senior officials are grappling with mounting evidence that the Trump administration's aggressive tariff strategy, intended to force manufacturing back to U.S. soil and boost domestic auto jobs, is generating unintended headwinds across key sectors. Insiders report increasingly tense briefings where the focus has shifted from early optimism about reshoring gains to growing alarm over disruptions in the deeply intertwined North American auto supply chains. The 25% duties on imported vehicles combined with elevated steel and aluminum tariffs were meant to incentivize U.S.-based production and protect American workers in manufacturing-heavy states. Yet the reality has proven messier. Integrated supply lines mean U.S. assemblers rely heavily on cross-border parts from Canada and Mexico, with components often crossing frontiers multiple times. This complexity multiplies costs rather than containing them, as compliance with partial USMCA exemptions adds layers of bureaucracy without fully shielding against the duties. Reports indicate that some domestic producers now face higher input expenses, squeezing margins and prompting quiet reevaluations of long-term investment plans. Concern is particularly acute in swing manufacturing states where auto jobs are politically vital. Officials are tracking signs that prolonged friction could dampen growth rather than accelerate it, potentially through reduced output, delayed expansions, or even localized slowdowns if supply disruptions persist. While the White House continues to publicly insist the tariffs are delivering long-term wins by pressuring companies to prioritize American facilities, private discussions reflect unease that the policy risks backfiring. Higher costs for U.S. consumers via elevated vehicle and parts prices, combined with possible job pressures if demand weakens amid affordability strains. The administration's internal mood reflects a broader tension. Early assessments highlighted potential for reshored capacity, but as 2026 unfolds, the emphasis has turned to mitigating fallout from supply chain chaos. Insiders describe a scramble to monitor indicators like production shifts, inventory builds, and consumer spending trends in auto-dependent regions, all while preparing for the looming USMCA review that could force hard choices on tariff adjustments or deeper renegotiations. The fear is palpable. What was sold as a tool to strengthen U.S. manufacturing might instead weigh on growth in the very heartland states the policy aimed to champion. With the mandated USMCA review scheduled for later in 2026, officials in Ottawa and Washington are gearing up for what many describe as make-or-break talks. The agreement's built-in sunset clause requires a joint evaluation this year, opening the door to potential renegotiation of rules, tariff exemptions, and dispute mechanisms. The ongoing 25% U.S. duties on imported vehicles and elevated steel aluminum levies, coupled with Canada's retaliatory measures, have kept cross-border auto flows under severe strain, raising production costs and complicating compliance. Insiders say both sides recognize the auto sector's critical role in supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs across the continent, yet deep divisions persist over reshoring goals versus supply chain integration. Pressure is mounting to reach a workable compromise before prolonged friction inflicts deeper economic damage. Canadian buyers are bearing the earliest and most visible brunt of the tariff standoff. As manufacturers exhaust pre-tariff inventories and internal cost buffers, more of the 25% U.S. import duties and reciprocal levies are flowing directly to showroom floors. Average new vehicle transaction prices, which held relatively steady or even dipped slightly in parts of 2025, are now trending upward into 2026, with industry forecasts pointing to 3.54% increases across key segments. Dealerships report rising sticker prices on popular SUVs, pickups, and crossovers, models heavily reliant on cross-border parts, while affordability concerns push some shoppers toward used vehicles or delayed purchases. The ripple is spreading fast. Tighter new supply dynamics are already sustaining elevated demand and prices in the used market nationwide. The White House continues to project unwavering confidence in its tariff strategy, repeatedly asserting that the 25% duties on imported vehicles, along with elevated steel and aluminum levies, are successfully driving reshoring and bolstering American manufacturing. Administration officials highlight early signs of domestic investment commitments and claim the measures protect national security while promoting long-term job growth in key auto-producing regions. Public statements emphasize that the policy is yielding major wins for U.S. workers, with exemptions for certain USMCA-compliant goods positioned as proof of balanced implementation that shields integrated supply chains without undermining the core objective. Despite these assurances, internal assessments and industry feedback reveal mounting concerns over unintended consequences. Reports indicate that higher input costs from layered tariffs are pressuring margins for U.S.-based assemblers reliant on cross-border parts, potentially slowing expansions and threatening employment stability in manufacturing-heavy states. Economists and some auto executives warn that prolonged friction could dampen overall sector growth rather than accelerate it, as compliance burdens and supply disruptions offset any near-term reshoring benefits. The administration maintains that any short-term pain is necessary for sustained domestic gains, framing the tariffs as a necessary tool to counter offshoring trends and strengthen the U.S. auto footprint. As 2026 begins, the North American auto trade standoff is entering a decisive phase, with manufacturers on both sides of the border acknowledging that earlier mitigation tactics, such as drawing down pre-tariff stockpiles, internal cost sharing, and temporary incentives, are largely depleted. This exhaustion leaves fewer options to shield consumers from the cumulative impact of the U.S. 25% vehicle import tariffs, reciprocal Canadian duties on select U.S. origin autos and materials, and persistent steel aluminum levies. Industry forecasts converge on sharper price pressures ahead, with average new vehicle costs expected to rise noticeably as structural expenses flow downstream to dealerships. Canadian buyers are already seeing the effects in rising transaction prices for crossovers, SUVs, and pickups heavily dependent on integrated sourcing, while U.S. consumers face indirect hits through disrupted parts availability and potential production adjustments. The escalation coincides with preparations for the high-stakes USMCA review later this year, heightening uncertainty around possible exemptions, rule changes, or deeper renegotiations. Without swift breakthroughs in talks, the standoff risks entrenching higher costs across the continent, affecting affordability, demand patterns, and long-term investment decisions in the deeply linked auto sector. To wrap this up on the Kaitlan Collins report, we've seen how these tariffs, designed to revive U.S. manufacturing, are instead fueling price surges in Canada, supply chain chaos, and real worries in Washington about job losses and economic slowdowns in key states. From exhausted buffers leading to 3.54% hikes, modest 2025 increases giving way to sharper 2026 jumps, retaliatory duties locking in friction, tense internal briefings on backfire risks, the looming USMCA review as a potential turning point, consumers feeling the pinch first through rising transaction prices, the White House's defiant public stance amid private alarms, to this fast-developing escalation where the full weight lands on wallets everywhere. It's a high-stakes saga with no easy fixes. If talks stall, we're looking at sustained inflation, disrupted investments, and broader ripple effects that could redefine North American trade for years. That's our deep dive tonight. Stay tuned as this trade tension unfolds. For more, follow the Kaitlan Collins report. Good night.